Hey everyone, this is Will, and welcome to this brand new and exciting episode of The Missing Piece. Now, if you follow the news closely, especially regarding China, recently, the current sitting president of China paid a short visit to one of the important region of China, which is Hong Kong. Well, given the fact that this year actually marked the 25th anniversary since the unification between Hong Kong and the mainland China. But meanwhile, that China has been seen on one hand one of the political rivals not only with the US but also with countries across the continent. But on the other hand, countries in Southeast Asia, they're seeing China as the opportunity to build their political and social influence. But in this episode, I think it's important that we need to dive into the internal system regarding China and also this ongoing political and social battle within the Communist Party. So that's why today it's my great honor to invite Dr. Zoe Liu, and she is the Fellow for International Political Economy at the Council on Foreign Relations. And we're going to talk to Dr. Liu about her amazing article, and especially regarding this economic war between China and the rest of the world. Without further ado, Dr. Liu, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Will, for having me. It's an honor.
No problem, Dr. Liu. The pleasure is all mine. Now, again, let's get to the question right away. Initially, when I discovered you, because this amazing article that you wrote, and it's entitled, China is Hardening Itself for Economic War, and right off the beginning, this is something you wrote, and I quote, Chinese policymakers are increasingly convinced that the U.S. is determined to implement a full-fledged strategy of containment against China, end quote. I guess the question I want to ask, or we're very interested in knowing, is where does the U.S. get the source and to understand that China is waging or either a political or economic war against the U.S.? So can you help us to understand what are you trying to say, or what were you trying to say that you were saying the U.S. is determined? What about the source? How did they get information?
Right now, if exactly as you said, if people follow the news closely, you probably wouldn't be surprised to find that Western policymakers have constantly been saying these days to say China is determined to decouple from the West. Despite that, the Chinese understanding or the narratives from Chinese policymakers or Chinese academics they were trying to argue that China is putting into these positions the so-called forced decoupling. So there is this kind of a back and forth going on, right? But from the U.S. perspective, the current narrative really originates or reflects a kind of deep-seated sense of vulnerabilities among Western policymakers since the global financial crisis, 2007 to 2008, and then followed by exacerbating domestic social economic issues such as inequality, so on and so forth, right? So there is a sense of, and at the same time, this is also the relative rise of China, and since President Xi took power in late 2012, and then officially 2013. Western policymakers initially thought he would be a very reform-oriented leader, but then there is a perceived turn in terms of his policymaking, both economically and socially, and in foreign policy arena. And more specifically by this, I mean from Western policymakers' perspective, the perceived President China under President Xi Jinping becomes much more aggressive, both in terms of the China's international economics policies, as the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, and many scholars from our politicians in the West describe that as China's intentionally waging or set up a debt trap. And then on the diplomatic front, people in the West citing China's coercive use of economic statecraft, whether it is Norwegian salmons or Australian wines and coals or Filipino bananas, right? China is being perceived as increasingly becoming aggressive. And then on the other hand, China did not necessarily back up during the Trump administration with regard to the ever escalating U.S.-China trade war. So, in this, I would say since 2000, since the end of since the global financial crisis, the relative perceived relative decline of the West versus the relative rise of China seems to put these two countries in clash.
Dr. Liu, again, as you were describing, I guess we wouldn't say the beginning of the clash, or we'll say the end of the clash. But one thing that you stood out that during your description, going back to the word decoupling. And we know that since the deadlock between China and the U.S. took place, we have heard the word decoupling for many times and during many occasions, not only from the U.S. political officials or economic experts, but also within Chinese government as well. I mean, again, if we follow the state media, that decoupling, again, no one would like to see the two largest economies would like to decouple with each other. But now, going back to your article, and the next question is very simple. How much do you think China can afford to decouple, from the US? So in other words, at this moment, every single country is facing this economic shift, before the pandemic, in the midst of the pandemic. But for China today, if I'm not mistaken, again, as you mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative, this is something that can be pushed in a greater way, especially for the Chinese Communist Party and for the Chinese economy. But imagine if the country decides, hypothetically, to decouple from the US, how much can China afford? If China decides or were to decide to take such actions, how much benefit or how much drawbacks will both countries receive? Can you help us to understand?
Yeah, that's a great question, Will. And for economists, the favorite thing to do is not necessarily making forecasting, because we are terribly at doing that. But we wanted to analyze things, social or economic issues, from the perspective of costs and benefits, right? The cost benefit analysis. And in this particular scenario, the so-called decoupling. First of all, let me just be clear. I am strongly against any narratives or any possibilities of decoupling, because it hurts everybody. So, in other words, when I look at all these narratives or the potential moves from decoupling the U.S.-China trade wars, both countries hurts, because and it hurts not just the two giants, but also all these middle powers, all the middle powers that are in between China and the United States, because nobody wanted to make a choice.
That's right.
Singapore doesn't want to make a choice. Vietnam doesn't want to make a choice. Neither Japan or any European Union countries, right? So let me just be clear that it's going to be, if decoupling were ever to happen, it is going to be extremely costly, and it will be collateral damages, not just for the United States and China, these two economies, but also for the world, just in general. Now, let's just, for the sake of this mental exercise, let's say hypothetically, if any policymakers woke up a day and decided they just want to go ahead with it. So the cost, I would say, there would be tremendous amount of direct political and economic cost for both countries, and then there would be secondary effect, or even a third degree of effect on other countries, right? So who are dependent upon both the United States and China from the perspective of supply chains, technology, the supply of critical minerals, the refinery process, as well as talent and a lot of these advanced industries, advanced industrial standard. Because right now we are saying, not just, for example, the 5G, Huawei had hired more than 400 lawyers to basically lobbying for the Huawei standard versus
That's right.
the European or American standard. So if the world, let's say, if we were degraded into a scenario where there is Western standard versus Chinese standard, or the so-called East and West split, we might end up having, hey, my cell phone might not be able to call your cell phone because the two are of the network are of two different standard, and hence we probably need some sort of intermediary or transitory stuff to help us communicate. This is going to be very costly. So it's I guess what I wanted to say is decoupling would be a game of chicken, and what end up happening would probably be, or what would help policymakers to think about it is the cost on which side would be bigger. If somebody decided that the cost on the enemy's side would be bigger, or the adversary side would be bigger, probably that's that would be good enough reason for some people to out of their mind to decide to go ahead with it.
Dr. Liu, that was a great point. Again, it was only a hypothetical scenario, but today we are looking at year 2022, and no one would like to see two largest economies competing neck to neck with each other. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the economic competition, but if we are really coming down to decoupling away from each other, or decoupling, which means separation away from each other, I think that would be the end of the whole economic system. Now, let's get to the next question, Dr. Liu. Go back to the article. Again, one word that you use strategically that you mentioned, it's called SelfReliance Strategy. When we look at the Chinese history, or when we look at the Chinese Communist Party, I guess many words could come to our mind, but one thing is the word called preservation. So in other words, that we know that Chinese people for centuries they are well known for relying or depending on either the government or depending on themselves, their own source, their own labor. But again, looking at today, something that you wrote, I want to share with everyone, that you said that it will double down on pursuing a pre-existing self-reliance strategy and sanction-proof the Chinese economy while bolstering its offensive geoeconomic capabilities by reinforcing China's strategic position in the global supply. Now, my next question to you is, how much can China afford this, what we called, or what you call, Dr. Liu, this self-reliance strategy? I mean, again, I'm not saying that China cannot do it, but given the fact that today, let's just say, if one country decides to run its own course, despite the complication, despite the globalization, significantly speaking, or realistically speaking, it's got to be really difficult. So can you help us to, what does that mean to have this self-reliance strategy? And number two, how feasible it is today for China or for any other country to build this self-reliance strategy in terms of its economic scenario?
Yeah, thank you, Will, for another great question. I would say, let me just sort of step back a little bit, by saying that China, this is not the first time that China ever proposed to strengthen self-reliance, right? The country funded, when the country was established in 1949, it was funded at a time where there was no good friend except the Soviet Union, which China very suspicious of, right? So in many ways, China was funded with no trusted friend. In many ways, the only friend that China took side with, take the so-called take on one side,
right,
ended up it quickly soured within 10 years, right? The Sino-Soviet split in late 50s and 60s. Right. So, in many ways, does China, or the Communist Party in particular, does the Chinese Communist Party have experience handling, international isolation or containment? It has. However, I would argue that the cost of, looking for a scenario in which China has to rely upon itself today is going to be much more costly than what it was before. Because in 1949, China, the Communist Party inherited a war-torn economy, right? In many ways, China was, China in 1949 is by no means comparable
That's right.
to China today. Because when China was established, it was poor. It was among the poorest country in the world by the World Bank standard. If I remember, it probably like among the bottom five. Poorer than many African countries.
That's right.
Right. But now China has already become emerged as en route by many estimations, right? By many estimations, China might take over the United States to be the largest economy by 2025, which is 3 years from now. So depending upon, in other words, China's rise from a poorest country to one of the major superpowers in the world actually benefited from China's participation in internationalization, in globalization. So in many ways, globalization benefited Chinese people, Chinese economy, Chinese labor, Chinese supply chain, and in many ways it saved the Chinese Communist Party in many ways, because many scholars would argue, both Chinese scholars and foreign scholars would argue, well, for a long period of time, the Communist Party derives its political legitimacy from rapid economic growth, or at least for a long period of time it has been that way, right? So if the Communist Party ever wanted to self-inflict a self-reliance strategy, meaning it is going to cut its own arms and legs by not participating in globalization, that is going to be terribly wrong. And I think policymakers knows that. Whether if you look at President Xi Jinping, or Prime Minister Li Keqiang, or any other or Liu He or Yi Gang, all these Chinese policymakers, none of them argued that they are looking for they are looking for a decoupling. Everybody's telling you this is bad. We are not looking for it, and China is championing globalization, right? But the narrative has shifted to the point where they've had to prepare for the worst. The idea is, since Donald Trump coming into power, there is this, U.S.-China relations has been deteriorating, and the on the one hand, throughout President Xi's terms, a lot of, he has been dealing with three generations of American policymakers, from Obama, Trump, and Biden. Everybody imposed sanctions on Chinese firms, and for a variety of reasons, whether it is Xinjiang, whether it is, connections to the PLA, for a variety of reasons, right? So, the Chinese policymakers cannot feel secure when they are constantly receiving this kind of treatment from the U.S. policymakers. So, and obviously, COVID did not help. So, there is reason for Chinese policymakers to think that this is a critical moment where the West decided to turn their back against China.
Dr. Liu, again, you made several significant points, especially regarding the current sitting president, Xi Jinping. We're going to talk about that in a second. But again, coming back to the world, and we know that when let me take a step back. While U.S. and China are battling with each other economically or politically, each side is making greater effort in terms of strengthening the relationship with friends and with allies. And surely, again, going back to the article, that China today seems, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Liu, seems to gain more partners because the Belt and Road Initiative more than ever. It doesn't matter if the country would like to be the partner with China willingly, or, again, we're saying the word is by force or without any other choices. But meanwhile, some of the countries are still very sensitive to the U.S. For example, the country of Iran, the country of Afghanistan, and also, of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine, the country of Russia. So, Dr. Liu, my next question is, what strategies is China taking, or the Chinese government taking today, in order to gain more trust from those countries who are having this hesitant or distrust, or even what we call disengagement relationship with the U.S. So in other words, we're looking at Russia, we're looking at Iran, we're looking at Afghanistan, we're looking at any other countries, I guess, in Africa, on the African continent. they seem to play their chips in the basket of China, but meanwhile, they're willing to walk away or they're willing to disengage themselves with the US. What is China doing to convince those countries, and how does that hurt US economically? Can you help us to understand that?
That's a great question. Well, I like the way you how you think about it, because you are thinking like a classic military strategist, thinking about how to create a wedge in between, the undecided partners versus your strategic rivals. I like the way you think about it. And I would say in many ways, again, this is in times of great power rivalry. It is a tragic moment because it is going to hurt a lot of not just themselves but also spill over collateral damages. But then at the same time, it is also an opportunity for many middle powers or smaller powers to trying to exploit both sides. Isn't it? Right? So it's almost like high school popularity context all over again, because Biden comes up with the Build Back Better and the international version of it, trying to convince everybody, hey, we are offering money and we are offering an alternative to China, whereas China has also been the Chinese government has been trying to say, hey, it's great if you are trying to put the developing countries finally come over to the world, trying to help developing economies, and the Biden put out the Indo-Pacific economic economic framework, whereas China has its own China has its own version of economic framework in the region, or participating in various layers, I would say, both in terms of like the trilateral in Northeast Asia versus the entire Asia Pacific, right? So it almost feels like in terms of a high school popularity context, what do voters do? Voters would probably get a lot of goodies from both candidates. So that's why we are saying that it almost feels like both the United States and China are making a lot of promises, but it is a matter of to what extent countries can deliver. On the one hand, China has been practicing this for many years because of the state-owned enterprises and all under the framework of or umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative, and we have the China's policy banks, in particular Export-Import Bank in Africa, and all that, making a lot of loans, regardless whether Chinese policy banks actually have the capacity to assess the feasibility or to what extent the project are bankable or not, right? And so China does not necessarily have strong military presence at the United States, but it does have a lot of state-controlled capital, whereas the United States does not have that. However, I would also wanted to say that although the U.S. government doesn't have a lot of those state-owned capitals, Congress is notorious for getting together and agree on things, in particular in today's political scenario. But American private sector has been doing a lot of these development issues, development project in third world or developing countries. It's not that we are not. America or Europe hasn't been doing it. If you look at who are the classic developers in Africa, it's the French, it's the German, it's the Belgians.
That's right.
So and there's all the Japanese. So in many ways, China is not necessarily the only person who is trying to do this. It's just that the partners, the methodology have been relatively different from the West, and also China's way has been relatively different from Americans or the Europeans. Hence, Chinese firms are not necessarily at their best to do corporate communication. Even if they are doing certain things, there is a lack of communication which can be translated or be understood or be interpreted as, oh, this is terrible. This is a lack of transparency from Americans' perspective. Therefore, there are these layers of cultural, business governance differences that might help translate into misunderstandings. But then I guess the short answer to your question is, Yes, you are right. Both countries are trying to make promises, but the agents are different, and the way of doing business is different, and also the capacity is different. American or Japanese private sectors, they have been accumulating decades of capacities of doing environmental assessment, project feasibility assessment, whereas our policy banks, they don't have that.
Dr. Liu, again, I know you're fairly busy, and I got two more questions before letting you go. I want to talk about something recently took place. Again, that's something I also mentioned in the intro. Recently, that sitting Chinese President Xi Jinping paid a short visit to one of the important region of China, which is Hong Kong. Again, this year marks the 25th anniversary that will either, again, you can call it the unification between Hong Kong and mainland China, or even the late article it's called Chinafication. So in other words, for Xi Jinping to visit Hong Kong, to directly not only met the people in Hong Kong, but also keep in mind, he just elected, or should I say, the party just elected a brand new person to be the executive officer for the region. Dr. Liu, my question to you is, how significant was it for Xi Jinping to pay the visit to Hong Kong in person and also deliver the speech? During the speech, he made significant points regarding the future of Hong Kong, the relationship between Hong Kong and mainland China, especially to understand the younger generations, their social or political unrest. So from your perspective, what can we make of his trip to Hong Kong, and how significant is or was his visit to the people of Hong Kong?
Right, that's a great question. It touches upon something that I personally care a lot myself. I visited Hong Kong both as a tourist and for conferences, and I love the place. Good food. Despite people always complain that Hong Kong people sometimes, unless you are super rich, many people live in matchboxes, one on top of another. But hey, it's a very dynamic place, and
That's right.
Hong Kong has been a very important financial hub and cultural hub in the world. It's where, in many ways, it's where the East meets the West. Therefore, I would say not just normal people realize it, not just the British or the Americans know that. Leaders of the Communist Party knows it, and it would be terrible. It would be terrible. It would be an international image damage and reputation damage if the Chinese Communist Party does not handle Hong Kong right. Right? And Hong Kong is also presented as a window for, how they have their scheme they have their visions for Taiwan.
That's right.
And over the past few years, the domestic issues within China and, Hong Kong societal angst against the mainlanders, whether it is people coming to Hong Kong to be babies, so on and so forth, there has been a lot of, societal issues at a people-to-people level bursting up, right? And apart from, the narrative that, Hong Kong's future as, international financial hub is dead and all that. So I think, this is President Xi's very first trip outside of mainland.
That's right.
And in person. And if you remember when he delivered the speech, he was not wearing a mask.
That's right.
So, so I think all these signs, it's not, when leaders like Xi Jinping make a trip, give a speech, everything has to be heavily choreographed. So I think this it has a very important, significant meaning or symbolic meaning. But, from practical side, it shows, Chinese leaders really wanted to make Hong Kong right. And hey, this is the first time they give it a try with the so-called one country, two system. Hong Kong was and has been the window. So, has there been a lot of policy, contentious point, national security law, trying to impose that in Hong Kong. And of course, that is going to go against what Western people perceive it, or Hong Kong people, local Hong Kong people perceive it, because the education system, the value system in between mainland and China has been dramatically different. So this kind of the difference in perceptions would contribute to the brewing of this kind of misunderstanding as well as the conflict. But then on the other hand, are there signs to show mainland really wanted to get it right? At least from economic and financial side, I think yes, there is. For example, Hong Kong Monetary Authority participated in this regional renminbi, liquidity, regional renminbi liquidity pool, right? They
That's right.
Announced earlier, late June, right? So, and many people were surprised. Hey, what does that mean for what does that mean for renminbi internationalization? Does that mean China is trying to beaten down the U.S. dollar's hegemonic power and trying to take over the renminbi is trying to take over the dollar? My interpretation is, hey, why people should be surprised about it? If you look at Hong Kong Monetary Authority's policies, they have been doing some these kind of things for a long time since we participated in the Denson bond, participated in trying to develop a renminbi offshore market. So they have been doing it, and they have been having these renminbi liquidity facilities for several years. So it's a natural thing for regional partners to do. So, in many ways, it just shows that people, I guess, the long story short from that perspective, at least from economic and financial aspect, the Chinese Communist Party wanted to make Hong Kong right. And by strengthening Hong Kong's position in international finance through renminbi, the role of the renminbi, building a renminbi market, Hong Kong probably can get, sort of like a booster as, at least an alternative, place where people can not only have access to dollar liquidities, but also to renminbi liquidity, which is important for countries that you mentioned earlier, whether it is Iran, whether it's Russia, or, other countries that are probably on the verge of being sanctioned by the United States.
Dr. Liu, I want to end our conversation again going back to your article. This is towards the last proportion of the article that you wrote. It's time for the U.S. to lend a sympathetic ear to countries that have longed for development support or demanded representation in the existing global system before they hear China's appeals instead. And also, that news came out within the past 48 hours that Chinese government, one of the representatives within the Chinese government, had another phone call exchange with another representative from the Biden administration in terms of this economic partnership or this economic trade war or etc., whatever you call it. But right now, again, as an average citizen in both countries, people are still questioning, what is the purpose of those phone calls? So in other words, if both sides would like to work together, why can't we see any progress? Is it because U.S. today, it's sitting at a crossroads because the midterm election, or because people are saying Donald Trump is coming back? We can believe all the rumors or all the facts. But meanwhile, we only hear the news that phone calls after phone calls and conference after conference or visit after visits, but no progress, at least for people on both sides, have not seen, have not heard. So my last question to you, Dr. Liu, is why bother? If there's no progress, why even bother to try it? Or stop all the political sound bites. Let's get to work so that the people can receive or can at least see some changes. Help us understand.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Will, like why bother, right? Yeah, I totally agree with you. Why there are so many phone calls, so many so-called bilateral engagement with no progress. But then at the same time, right now I would say engagement is probably become a polluted word in the U.S. policy making sphere, because for anybody who especially if you talk to Congress people or senators, for anybody who try to make a case for positive engagement with China, that person is going to be considered as weak. You are not a weak, you are not strong enough to defend America. You are putting America's interest at risk. So the reason why engagement cannot becomes like a taboo word in among American policymakers. Part of that is because, the fragmentation of American politics right now means two parties cannot agree on anything, but they can agree on one issue, which is China is bad. That's the ridiculous. That's the ridiculous part of it, and it's very frustrating for scholars, for business people, because hey, if you look at American business people, do they want to go to China and do business deals? Yes, of course they want to.
That's right.
But a lot of these policy initiatives and these bad narratives really is not helping. And if you talk with American business people who are actually currently in China, they would tell you, this is frustrating, and we wanted to make sure that the two countries are working together towards the right direction, so that we can return business to normal. Because in many ways, U.S. and China, these two countries are the bilateral activities are so deeply entrenched in terms of not just in terms of finance or economics or trade, but also people to people relationship. And right now, you see American policymakers are trying to call Chinese students as all Chinese students are spies. If they are bad, we should stop having Chinese students coming to the United States. But hey, if you ask American professors, you ask American universities, they realize, we need RAs and TAs who can actually do the job. And we also need, tuitions that Chinese students actually pay. They do not take student loans from U.S. government. They actually pay tuitions, right? So, it's frustrating for many people. Politicians talk at one level, but it's, normal people who go to the groceries have to pay, Donald Trump tariff on China. Those are the people who actually suffered. So, but I would say, despite all these lack of progress, talks, phone calls, meeting with each other, even it means a fight face to face, is still important. And I'm a big fan and I'm a big believer in maintaining open communication rather than rhetoric. Let's get on the phone and yell at each other. Those are not the kind of communication that I want the two countries to have. Instead, the two countries really have to, we understand that we don't agree with each other on so many levels, but hey, let's see how we can make things better.
That's right.
And don't you think this is so much familiar? Anybody who have married, or you had a boyfriend or girlfriend, hey, the two of you are going to fight, and there will be a moment where the two of you would hate each other to the gut. But if you go to a relationship or marriage counselor, they would say, hey, how about you guys just talk frankly, right? And I think it's important for the two countries' policymakers to recognize that and just sit down, recognize that, yes, things are not easy, but let's just try to make things better. And probably, right now is on the phone. I do not know the details about the phone call. I was not on the phone call, but judging from the timing, the Biden administration is the time for the administration to review whether the Trump tariffs on China is about to expire or not. So, and it would be a good thing. It's a low-hanging fruit. It would be a good thing if the Biden administration can make a step forward.
Dr. Liu, I think that was a very positive and also encouraging note. And again, as someone who studied communications my whole life, and I believe on one hand, communication is the key, because as long as we can keep the conversation going, and that means the word engagement. So in other words, neither of the side is willing to quit yet. Again, given the fact that Richard Nixon paid the first visit to China in the year of 1972, and I think that significantly opened the door not only for the US but also for the world to see what China looked like. But today, China is making so hard or trying so hard to present itself to the world. But again, ladies and gentlemen, I am very honored to speak to Dr. Zoe Liu, and she's a fellow for international political economy at the Council on Foreign Relations. And I strongly encourage everyone to go online and look at Dr. Liu's article and regarding how Beijing or China is preparing for the possible economic war and decoupling with the West. But again, Dr. Liu, thank you so much for taking your time to join the show, and we'd love to have you back on the show. And again, for further discussions as we continue to watch and monitor the political and social cultural changes within China and the Communist Party.